Now, let's shift gears. You're not part of the UN, but let's go to the United Nations and focus. I know you're very knowledgeable about the United Nations. And of course, Kofi Annan, past Secretary General of the United Nations, retired. What do you think were some of the, I know you knew him professionally and personally, what do you think were some of the major accomplishments of Secretary General Kofi Annan in his 10-year service or 10-year tenure as Secretary General of the United Nations?
I guess the first thing that pops to mind is that aside from some feelings in this country about this leader, he was the most respected spokesperson in the world on issues of all types, regional disputes, global disputes, peace and war. And a poll was taken by the State Department last year, shortly before he left, to determine, in general, who were the top people in the world who had credibility, and how many of them were American government officials. And without me knowing how many Americans got into the list, by far number one in the world as the most respected, objective commentator on the world was on world affairs was Kofi Annan. Through all the problems of oil for food, through all the disenchantment in this country over his position in opposition to the war in Iraq, he emerges still as the number one voice. I guess that voice, which comes from both this particular individual and from the position he held, is the sort of crowning achievement which got him the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, as well as a lot of recognition around the world. In addition to that, he was head of the UN during its most rapid growth as an organization. The demands on it and the requirements for it to perform were higher than they've ever been. This has been an organization which, despite the budget cap which we've placed on them, has had every year more active role in peacekeeping, more natural disasters to handle, ever more refugees out of homes, in need of food, in need of succor, a much greater threat of global disease, which the World Health Organization works on. So the geometric progression of UN-related issues, in which the UN is the only organization that can deal with it, has taken place under him. I guess, and he's managed this growth in a remarkable way through getting very good people to work with him. I guess the third thing I'd say is his focus on the peacekeeping and use of force question. He, in response to the concerns about his role and the UN's role in Rwanda, failing to stop the genocide, and similar experiences in the former Yugoslavia, he tried to find a way to formulate how does the UN respond to, in the case of nations who can't protect their people or choose not to protect their people. And so he created this concept of responsibility to protect, which means that a government cannot remain sovereign, retain absolute sovereignty if it can't protect or if it's even killing its own people. And under that principle, the UN Charter does not have to change, but the provisions under which you can intervene with UN Security Council approval are recognized. And I think his attention to the importance of the UN Charter's view of how do you restrain the use of force has been consistent with what I believe and what most of our members believe is core to the United Nations work. Use military force in self-defense or in defense of another country, member state. But do not use military force for other reason unless there's exceptional circumstance that has to be approved by the Security Council. It's a simple principle, and if all of us abided by that principle, there would be no war.
Now, a lot of the UN observers think that Kofi Annan, history is going to view him as probably the greatest Secretary General. They always put him sort of in contention with Dag Hammarskjöld, who's usually viewed as the most effective Secretary General. But as you mentioned, Kofi Annan, even though there were some problems, he had many, many successes. And of course, we think of the Millennium Development Goals, which are working to eliminate poverty by the year 2015, the Peace Building Commission that will work to help countries that are coming out of civil strife to help them get on their feet and to become independent. He implemented a lot of internal management reforms at the United Nations. But let's shift forward. Now we're into the 21st century.
I don't think any of those, by the way, are fundamental to his leadership. I think his leadership was more on a higher level.
Right.
Than that.
Those were just programs that he happened to be involved with. Yes, exactly. But let's talk about the current United Nations. What do you look upon, or how do you view the UN today? And of course, there's a new Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. What do you think will be the 2 or 3 major problems or issues or challenges that he will confront, he and the United Nations, the 192 countries in the UN?
What's interesting about Ban is he has taken off, I think, in the right direction. This new Secretary General first realized that the divide that got larger and larger over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly over the contention with regard to over the Iraq War, and also over the divisions that were created, particularly last year in the whole reform exercise. You find the group of 77, which were now 129 countries, basically the third world, developing world group, and the developed world, led particularly by the United States, has grown wider and wider, and particularly over the U.S. behavior. And so the third world has believed that somehow they've been left out of management. And so the first appointments that he made as Secretary General were all people from the developing world. He appointed a woman from Tanzania. He appointed a woman from Mexico. He appointed his chief of staff is from India, and his spokesperson is from Haiti. He's made a very conscious effort to say, look, you're in my administration, you're part of it, and believe me, I'm going to work with you. And that was an important political decision. Whether these people are the best for the job, we'll see. But it was an important message. The second thing that's interesting is he was seen basically as sort of a creature of the United States at a certain level, because we were secretly and then more and more publicly out for his being elected, even though all the 5 permanent members were behind him. The first thing he does is he goes to Washington and he announces that he's a strong supporter of UN action to reduce global warming. He has taken a very strong position on global warming. He wants to reconvene a summit. He wants to convene a summit to talk about how do you take Kyoto Treaty, which was trying to manage greenhouse gases emissions, and make a new effort at getting world agreement. And he's hitting it right at the right time, because this winter you've seen this dramatic increase in appreciation of the global warming issue. Can the UN become a real player in pulling the nations together to deal with probably the most threatening action that is taking place on this earth that may end civilization over the next 100 years? The third thing I think which is interesting is how can the UN become relevant in the struggle against terrorism? Is there a role for the UN, given all the inhibitions they have and the number of states which are sort of iffy on the question of terrorism? How will he deal with that? But probably the one that be most fascinating and one that could prove interesting and important is the role the UN can play in the Middle East. The United States has no longer got the leverage we used to have in the Middle East. We talk to one country very well. We talk to others not very well, and we talk to half the countries you have to talk to, not at all, including Iran, Syria, plus some of the quasi-terrorist political organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. We have no relationships at all with these places. And the UN does. The UN can have conversations with all players and find a way, as only the UN can do, to bring some type of a mobility in thinking about how do you solve the problems.
Well, these are very important issues, and they're going to be on center stage. They'll be in the forefront at the United Nations, and I wish we had more time to pursue them even further, but people can do that by going to www.unausa.org and learning more about the United Nations Association. And of course, they can learn more about the UN through your website or go to un.org. But Ambassador Bill Luers, I want to thank you very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.